The Supreme Court has thrown out a challenge to the Republican-drawn congressional map in Ohio. According to Democrats, the districts were gerrymandered in order to deliberately diminish that party's political power in the state.
That decision follows a June ruling that determined federal courts cannot hear challenges to partisan gerrymandering. But according to new reporting by The Intercept, the GOP's efforts to limit the impact of Democratic voters went even further and may have impacted maps drawn in Alabama, Florida, and West Virginia in 2010. David Daley is the reporter behind the three-part Intercept series, and he joins us now via Skype. Great to see you, sir.
Good morning.
So just start by laying out some of your reporting and what you found, because you really have dug into the details here.
Gerrymandering is really the basis of Republican majorities in state legislatures nationwide, as well as their advantage in Congress, and the reason why you're able to get 12-4 delegations out of Ohio and 10-3 delegations out of North Carolina. And the strategy goes back a decade. It goes back into the days right after Barack Obama is first elected in 2008. And terrified Republican strategists take a look at the changing demographics of the nation, and they realize that they could be doomed to become a minority party for a long time if they don't come up with a plan. They recognize that the census is coming up in 2010, and that after the census every 10 years, we redistrict every state, a legislative seat around the country, as well as Congress. So they set out on a really specific strategy to capture state legislatures in swing states around the country, and then to use new technology to really draw themselves enduring lines that have lasted throughout this entire decade and still provide Republicans with huge state majorities, even when they win fewer votes.
David, I just wonder, and I question whether this is a Republican thing at all. I mean, isn't gerrymandering pretty bipartisan? We've seen bipartisan cases come up for the Supreme Court just this year.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, gerrymandering has got a long history. I mean, as long as we've had politicians, they've tried to draw lines that have advantaged themselves. You can trace it back to Patrick Henry trying to gerrymander James Madison out of the very first Congress. The gerrymandering that happened this last cycle tends to be largely Republican in nature. Republicans kind of recognized the possibilities of the census and technology in 2010 in a way that Democrats kind of fell asleep on. Democrats, after Barack Obama wins in 2008, they really thought that they could just kind of ride out this demographic wave and that they were all set. And they snoozed on the all-important redistricting year in 2010. They got their clocks cleaned in state legislative races around the country. And they've been living with the consequences of that really ever since. There's a brutal Democratic gerrymander in Maryland that gives Democrats 7 of the 8 congressional seats there. But in 2018, this is kind of an interesting stat. There are 59 million Americans right now living in a state where one or both chambers of the legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election. And all of those chambers are Republican held, even though Democrats have more votes. So right now, there just isn't an example of a state where there's a Democratic gerrymander that holds even when Republicans win more votes.
Part of what has come to light recently is the files of this one guy who was sort of the godfather of Republican gerrymandering and seemed to look very specifically at racial breakdowns in terms of drawing these maps. Tell us about him. Tell us what his files have revealed.
His name is Thomas Hofeller, and in many ways, he is probably the most important Republican strategist of the last 4 decades who no one knows his name, and he kind of liked it that way because it allowed him to do his work from the shadows. And what Hofeller understood, even going back into the 1970s and the 80s, is that technology was going to change the nature of redistricting, that computers and voter data were going to make it possible to draw even stronger lines. And as the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in the early 1980s, and it essentially set up the creation of majority-minority seats wherever possible. What Hofeller and a handful of other Republicans recognized was that if they could work together with minority communities and help them draw majority minority seats, they would also be turning all of the surrounding districts whiter, more conservative, and more Republican. If they were able to pack all of the Democrat and minority voters into as few districts as possible, elect a handful of Black and Latino members, you would also see all of these delegations across North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee. They would move from electing white conservative Democrats to electing a handful of liberal Black Democrats, and then a wide number of conservative Republicans. And this is the beginning of the Southern strategy. And Hoffler, sort of all throughout his time, he dies in August of 2018, is always peering around the corner and recognizing what is going to come next to give Republicans an advantage in the redistricting. Before he died, he was working on a study of citizen voting age population, which would mean redistricting states not based on total population as we do now and as has been the constitutional standard for Congress for many years, but based on citizens of voting age, so excluding non-citizens, excluding anybody under the age of 18, because he recognized that that would give Republicans an advantage in state legislatures in places like Texas. So they are always thinking ahead as to kind of what might come next to give them an advantage in this map-making process.
Interesting. And where are we in terms of court battles? I mean, is this stuff legal?
It's a great question. What we always find is that folks are testing the very limits of that line. In June, of course, the Supreme Court threw out, they really closed the doors to the federal courthouses on any claims of partisan gerrymandering. And the result of that case is that you are going to see a number now of claims in state courts that partisan gerrymandering violates the fair, free, and open election clauses that about 25 of 50 states have. So Pennsylvania has already used this. There's a challenge underway right now in North Carolina, and I predict that we will see an awful lot more of those. The trick here is that there's a fine line between partisan gerrymandering, which the court has said we're not going to get involved in, and racial gerrymandering, which is unconstitutional. And what Hoffler and Republicans have done is really try to confuse the two in many ways, because so many Democrats, the other way around, because so many minority voters vote Democratic, it's possible to do partisan gerrymanders that look like racial gerrymanders, and to try to sneak them through the court that way. And I think that that's the real trouble with what the court ruled back in June.
Such an interesting story about just how much smarter and more aggressive Republicans have been in writing the rules of the elections to their benefit. Thanks for doing the work on this and for joining us today, David. Great to see you.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure.
Coming up, Senator Elizabeth Warren officially passes Joe Biden in the Real Clear Politics average of polls.
And what does the age breakdown of support actually look like between the candidates? Team Rising is going to break this all down next.